Emma Parker wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and peered through the kitchen window. The late afternoon sun bathed the suburban neighborhood in gold, casting long shadows over the neatly trimmed lawns. Across the street, Daniel Reed pushed a lawnmower in steady, rhythmic passes, his shirt clinging to his back with the effort. She lingered a moment longer than necessary, her eyes tracing the lines of his arms, the way his muscles tensed with each push. It wasn't a first time she'd noticed. With a sigh, she turned back to the chocolate soufflé cooling on the counter. It was perfect, light, airy, decadent. A labor of care, though she doubted Mark would notice. He rarely did anymore. His late nights at work had become routine, his presence in their home reduced to fleeting conversations over reheated dinners. The phone buzzed. A single message from Mark. Working late again. Don't wait up. Emma exhaled slowly. No, I miss you, no sorry. Just a fact, delivered without feeling. She picked up the dessert plate and, without thinking too much, stepped onto the porch. The summer air was warm, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. Daniel, she called, her voice light, almost playful. He stopped mid-stride, glancing up in surprise. For a second, he hesitated, then cut the mower's engine and walked toward her. Emma, he said, wiping sweat from his brow. Everything okay? She held up the plate. I made too much. Thought you might want to try some. His gaze flickered between her and the soufflé. A small smile played at the corner of his lips. You're spoiling me. She laughed softly. Just good manners. You work too hard. He took the plate, fingers brushing hers, a brief, insignificant touch, yet something in her chest tightened. Daniel picked up the fork she had brought along and took a bite. His eyes widened slightly, a genuine look of surprise crossing his face. This is incredible, he admitted, savoring it. Mark is a lucky man. She should have felt pride, but instead, a dull ache settled in her stomach. If only he knew. Emma folded her arms, leaning slightly against the porch railing. You and Lena don't bake together? Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. Lena barely has time to eat, let alone cook. Work keeps her busy. She heard what he didn't say. She's never home. It wasn't unlike her own situation. For a moment, silence settled between them, stretching longer than it should have. The air felt charged, as if something unspoken lingered just beneath the surface. I should probably. Daniel started, but he didn't move, his gaze steady on hers. Of course, she said quickly, though part of her didn't want the moment to end. He handed the empty plate back, fingers brushing hers again, slower this time. Thank you, Emma, he said, voice quieter now. She nodded, watching as he turned and walked back toward his house. He didn't look back, but she knew he felt it too, this strange, quiet pull neither of them had acknowledged. As she stepped inside, closing the door behind her, Emma realized something unsettling. She wanted him to come back tomorrow. Emma hadn't planned to be outside when Daniel passed by the next evening. Or at least, that's what she told herself. But as the sun dipped lower, casting amber light across the street, she found herself standing on the porch, fingers absent-mindedly smoothing the folds of her dress. She wasn't waiting. Not really. Yet, when Daniel emerged from his garage, wiping his hands on an old rag, her pulse quickened. He hesitated upon seeing her, as if debating whether to acknowledge her. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he walked over. Evening, he said, his voice casual. But his eyes, those dark, unreadable eyes, held something less certain. Emma lifted the plate in her hands, a coy smile touching her lips. No soufflé today. Just cookies. Thought I'd change things up. Daniel huffed a quiet laugh. You're determined to ruin my self-control, aren't you? She tilted her head. Just trying to be a good neighbor. His expression flickered, something unreadable passing through it, before he reached for a cookie. He took a slow bite, then closed his eyes for a moment, savoring. Emma shouldn't have been watching him so closely, shouldn't have noticed the way his throat moved as he swallowed. But she did. You really are something else, he murmured, shaking his head. Her smile faltered, just slightly. Mark never looked at her this way anymore. The thought unsettled her. She turned her gaze to the horizon, where the last slivers of daylight stretched thin across the sky. Lena home. Daniel exhaled through his nose, a wry sound. Nope. Conference in Chicago. Gone all week. Emma bit the inside of her cheek. She didn't ask if he missed her. Daniel leaned against the porch railing, his shoulder just inches from hers. He wasn't looking at her, but she could feel his presence in the space between them, in the warmth radiating off his skin. I don't get it, he said after a moment. You and Mark, been married, what, 10 years? 12, she corrected softly. He nodded. And yet, you seem, his voice trailed off, as if searching for the right word. Emma's fingers tightened slightly around the plate. Lonely. Daniel's gaze snapped to hers. He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. The air between them changed, thickened into something heavier, something neither of them had quite named yet. She should have laughed it off, made a joke about housewives and their boredom. Instead, she let the truth sit there, raw and unspoken. A warm breeze stirred the hem of her dress. She swallowed. I should go, Daniel said suddenly, but he didn't move. Emma turned to face him fully. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Do you want to? His jaw tensed. A muscle flickered in his cheek. I don't know, he admitted. For the briefest moment, neither of them moved. Then, from somewhere inside the house, her phone buzzed against the countertop, a shrill, unwelcome intrusion. Emma blinked, the spell broken. Daniel exhaled sharply, as if shaking off whatever had just passed between them. He straightened, rubbing the back of his neck. Thanks for the cookies, Emma. His voice was rougher than before. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. He turned, walking back toward his house without another word. This time, she wasn't just hoping he'd return tomorrow. She knew he would. Emma stood at the sink, staring out the window as the morning sun cast shifting patterns over the yard. She hadn't slept well. Her mind had replayed last night's encounter on a relentless loop. Daniel's words, the way he had looked at her, the hesitation in his voice. She shouldn't have asked him if he wanted to leave. She shouldn't have wanted the answer. The water ran warm over her hands as she rinsed the coffee mug Mark had left behind. He had gone early, as always, a perfunctory kiss to her cheek, the only evidence he had been there at all. The house was quiet. Too quiet. A soft knock at the door sent her heart into her throat. She turned, drying her hands quickly before opening it. Daniel stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, looking like a man who had made up his mind. Her fingers curled against the doorframe. You're here early. He exhaled, his gaze flicking past her, as if checking for any sign of Mark. I needed to see you. Emma swallowed. The air between them felt charged, but beneath it lay something heavier, an unspoken understanding of where this path could lead. Come in, she said before she could think better of it. Daniel hesitated only a second before stepping inside. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing them into a space neither of them seemed entirely sure how to navigate. Emma turned toward the kitchen, needing something, anything, to occupy her hands. Coffee, she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked to the counter, resting his palms on the cool granite. Emma. She froze. The way he said her name, it wasn't casual. Slowly, she faced him. His expression was conflicted, but his eyes burned with something unmistakable. I don't know what we're doing, he admitted. But I know it's not nothing. Her breath caught. She could lie, pretend it was just innocent companionship, but she was tired of pretending. No, she murmured. It's not. The silence between them thickened. Daniel took a step closer. Then another. She could feel the warmth of him now, smell the faint traces of soap and grass on his skin. Her pulse thrummed. She should step back, should put space between them. She didn't. Tell me to go, he said, voice rough. Her fingers twitched at her sides. The words should come easily, 3 simple syllables. But they didn't. Instead, she reached for his hand, fingers brushing against his palm. A sharp knock at the front door sent them both reeling back. Emma's heart lurched into her throat. Daniel exhaled harshly, stepping away as if the space between them hadn't just been razor-thin. Emma smoothed her hands over her dress, trying to steady her breath. I should get that. Daniel nodded, his jaw tight. She moved quickly to the door, schooling her features before pulling it open. Mark stood on the porch, briefcase in hand, his brow furrowed. Emma's stomach dropped. Forgot my laptop, he said, stepping past her without another glance. Daniel cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. I should go. Mark barely looked up.
Oh.
Morning, Daniel. Daniel nodded once before slipping out the door. Emma watched him go, pulse hammering. Mark retrieved his laptop from the dining table, oblivious to the storm that had just passed through the room. As he brushed past her on his way out, he pressed a distracted kiss to her temple. See you tonight. The door shut behind him, leaving Emma alone in the heavy silence. Her hands trembled. She didn't know if she was relieved or disappointed.